Thank you so much for joining. Happy to have you in our home, in our kitchen, where literally thousands of loaves of bread have been made over the last 6 years. And I'm thrilled to do this. Like I said, I started making bread about 6 years ago when a friend said, why don't you just get a bread machine? You know, it's really, really easy to do the kneading with the bread machine. And I did a little bit of research, bought one of them, and we basically never stopped. I always say that had I known how easy it is, I would have started way, way sooner. Today, we're not going to use the bread machine. We're going to start old school from scratch. And before we jump in, I'd love to pull up a little poll and ask you, oops, can't screen share. We could get that going.
Just one moment here.
Uh-huh.
Okay, now you should be good.
All right. Here we go. So this is a little poll. Hopefully I can make this go away. Ooh, there's too much stuff on this screen. So what I would like you to do is go to menti.com and use that code 450117. You can do that on your phone or wherever you want. And I just want to see where we are in terms of audience, whether we have a virtual room packed with passionate bread makers, or people who are occasionally making bread, or maybe somebody who's trying it for the first time. And that's totally okay. 6 years ago, I would have said, I have never made challah or any other bread. So if that's where you are, I'm thrilled that you're here, and I would love to take you on this journey. And maybe 6 years from now, you'll do a presentation at Herzl about your bread making skills. So if you're just signing on or just getting started, if you have a phone near you or anything that allows you to get on the web, please go to menti.com, use that code 450117. Love to see where we are in terms of experience. All right. So since we started late, I don't want to spend too much more time here. So it seems like we're heavily skewed towards the experienced end, which is great, but we're going to cater to all audiences here. So I have a slightly tricked out setup here, so I can actually move this camera here. When that happens, please don't think that you're on a roller coaster or something weird happened or the equipment is dropping down or whatever. It's just so that I can point it down and you can see what I'm actually doing here. In the meeting invite, there was a sheet, looked like this, that said what you need for challah making. I don't know if you're trying to follow along as we go or if you're trying to do it later, so that you have challah available tomorrow for the meeting with for the first Shabbat with the rabbi. I think I'm going to stop sharing here and start going. So what I want to do today is I want to equip you with 4 different things. One is I want to talk about what are the basic bread making ingredients and how do they work together. I want to talk about how do we make dough from scratch. I want to talk about and show you, of course, how do we braid challah, and then eventually how do we apply the egg wash and bake it off start to finish. I think that we're recording this session, so if I go too fast, which I probably will because we only have 45 minutes, you can go back and watch it there. And I also have a PowerPoint deck that I've used for classes with FRS at Herzl that is available for distribution. So basic ingredients, of course, is flour, yeast, which I have my stuff measured here, and water. Those are the most basic ones. You cannot make bread if you don't have water and flour and some kind of leavening agent, whether that is sourdough or baking powder for that matter, or yeast. Most commercial bread is made with yeast. And for the purpose of challah, we add salt, sugar, and oil, and a bunch of eggs. I like, for this particular recipe, I like using a whole egg, and then in addition, an egg yolk that gives it a nice yellow color. And the recipe is sized to produce 2 loaves of reasonable size, which is nice for a family with guests. So this is what they're going to look like when they're done, and this is the size. 2 of these is what this recipe produces. So what's the purpose? What are the flour and the yeast and the water doing together? For bread making, it's really, really important that the ratio between water and flour is right, or liquid in general. You want to make sure that you have, for each cup of liquid, you have exactly 3 cups of flour. And when I say 3 cups, here's a measuring cup. 3 cups of flour. I'm showing you what I'm doing here with the bag of flour. So I'm going in here and I'm trying to scoop really hard and press really hard. And then I come out with something like this. This is not a cup of flour. This is way more. Even if I straightened out the top, shook off a little bit like this is still way more than a cup. Even if I made it really, really, really smooth and flat like this is still way more than a cup. And why is that? Because I've scooped up and I've compressed the flour into my measuring cup. And so if that's your starting point, it's going to be really hard to produce nice and even dough because you're starting with too much flour. Your dough is going to be too dry. So I want to show you how I measure. And then I'm going to start kneading. And while I knead, I'm going to try talking about what is happening while we're kneading here. So I'm going to do the roller coaster thing here again. Don't be afraid, nothing bad is happening. I'm just pointing the camera down so that you can see what I'm doing here. So I use a big fat, so this is an empty cup. I use a big fat spoon and I carefully fill this spoon with flour. Note that I'm using a cup to catch whatever I have in spillovers. So I'm not pressing down, I'm not pushing down, I'm not trying to compact the flour in any way, shape, or form. And then I use the back of a measuring spoon that has a flat side to it, and I just scoop it off like this. And now I have, oops, a little bit too much here. Now I have exactly 1 cup of flour, which I need for this recipe. Now I went ahead earlier and already put 3 cups of flour in here. So this is my 4th cup of flour. And I'm going to add the other dry ingredients. Sugar, 1/2 cup. Salt, 1.5 teaspoons. I was told recently, you always learn something new, that because I use kosher salt, I was talking with someone and I told them I always use more salt than is in the recipes for bread making. And the person said, you must be using kosher salt. Kosher salt is more coarse, so it doesn't pack as densely as regular finer salt, and that's why you use a little bit more. And then last but not least, the yeast, 2¼ teaspoons typically. I'm going to use a little bit more. I'm going to use about 3 teaspoons. The reason is this dough, I'm actually not going to bake this off tonight. This dough is going to go in the fridge later so that I can bake off the challahs tomorrow, and then we'll have yummy, fresh, oven warm challah for Shabbat. Now I'm going to mix those dry ingredients a little bit around. make a little well. And then I'm going to combine my wet ingredients, a cup of water, 4 tablespoons of oil, and then, as I mentioned earlier, 1 large egg and an egg yolk. The extra egg yolk is for nice yellow color. Again, I'm going to mix this up a little bit. Toss this into my well, and then the fun starts, and we can start kneading. Take the wedding ring off, very important. Don't want to lose that in the dough, and then you just start mixing it. So what's happening, what I'm doing now is everybody's, I think, has heard the term gluten. What is gluten? Gluten is a protein that is present in almost all flours, especially the commonly used, so wheat, rye, oat to a small degree, kamut, spelt. They all have more or less gluten in it. And what happens when you start kneading and munching those gluten proteins together, they start connecting. So the purpose of the kneading in making challah or making any bread really is to sort of gently bang those gluten proteins together and help them build long protein chains. And it is these long protein chains that then will trap the air and make those little bubbles and allow the bread to rise. Now the question is, where does the air come from? The air comes from the yeast that reacts with the sugar. And so the yeast starts to grow, and as part of that growing process, produces those air bubbles, and that's what makes bread rise, and so on. So I'm going to dump this onto my work surface here. I love these silicone baking mats. So when you're kneading, you see that I'm not using my fingers. I'm actually using the back of the palm to see that this comes together nicely. And I'll just keep going for a while. Love to see if anybody is following along as I do this. I'd love to see what you're doing. See, the Langmans are busy.
We're trying to catch up.
Oh, good. Yeah, this is usually bread making from start to finish is a 3-hour process. You have about 15, 20 minutes or so of kneading and making the dough. You can see it looked a little messy initially here, lots of little bits and pieces, but the dough is coming together very nicely. And I'm going to pick up all these pieces here. And that's a sign that I know this recipe and I've measured nicely, right? So my dough, from the looks of it, it's not too wet, it's not too dry, it's coming together quite nicely. And that's the result of measuring the way I measured the flour initially. Always, people often say, well, you take it really, maybe it's because I'm German, but I really take this measuring part really, really seriously and say, well, if you're trying to make a square frame, why would you eyeball the sides, the 4 parts of the frame? Why would you not measure exactly your miter cuts and make sure that the frame comes properly together? It's not any different with my 4 cups of flour here that I want to measure. Getting a little sticky here. Maybe I spoke too soon and I actually will need have to add a little bit of flour here. Okay, can they contact Rebecca? Sure. Thank you. My wife was telling me that friends of ours can't get on. All right, I think I am actually going to, I should have not have boasted earlier. I'm going to add a little bit of flour. Of course, this is getting a little too sticky for my taste here. So while I'm doing this, keep doing it. If you have a bread machine at home, you'll notice most bread machines run for half an hour. So they knead and knead and knead and knead and knead. If you have a stand mixer, like one of those KitchenAids with a big dough hook, they work quite well too. The one thing that I noticed with them, we don't have one, but whenever I use them at a friend's house or a relative's house, is that the dough tends to travel up the hook and then it just spins around at the top of the hook. And so you have to stop the machine every once in a while and scrape the dough down to make sure that all the dough is actually being kneaded properly. This recipe, by the way, scales really well. So I have had the honor several times to use the kitchen at Herzl and make batches of challah with 10 pounds of flour per batch. And so if you do that with 2 batches, then you'll end up with between 50 and 60 chalot. It's quite a bit. This is 4 cups here. That, like I showed earlier, gives 2 really nice sized loaves. In the handout, there's a recipe for that's scaled down a little bit. It's 2/3 of the recipe. That's the one that we are using at home. It's enough for us and one other family. Even though challah in our house usually doesn't get old.
What do you do if your dough is not it's not moist enough?
You add water. So if you add water or flour, add it with great care. So if you imagine you're starting out with just you're starting out with 1 cup, which is 8 ounces, 16 tablespoons. So add maybe a teaspoon or half a tablespoon at a time. Don't go and add an ounce or 2, then you're going to be instantly on the too wet side.
For 4 cups flour, how much water?
Pardon me?
If we're having 4 cups flour, how much water?
For 4 cups of flour and the oil and the eggs, I use exactly 1 cup for 8 ounces of water.
We have another question from Linda Jacobs. Do we have to use instant yeast or can we use regular yeast?
So you can use regular yeast, but the regular yeast typically needs a process where you dissolve it in water and you add a little bit of sugar and you get it going. So since we make bread 3 or 4 times a week using the bread machine, I always use the instant yeast. It's just a lot more reliable. And we buy it by the pound. You can go, well, these days, it's a little bit more expensive. I recently bought a pound for, I think, $12 on Amazon. Usually I get it at cash and carry for about $4. If you buy yeast in the little packets or in the 4-ounce jars, it's pretty expensive. All right. So this is starting to come together nicely. So the question here is, how do you know when you're done? Well, you know you're done when you take a little bit of the dough. I'm going to try this. And I don't know how well this is going to work with the video camera here, and you try and pull it apart, and you can see it. It's actually almost like a little window, right? It's starting to form little windows. You can almost see through it without it ripping. So maybe another minute or two, and I should be there, right? That's what you want to achieve. That tells you that your strands of gluten have bonded together, and your dough is where you want it to be. One question that often comes up is, can you use other flour? Yes, you can use any other flour. I think the 5 or 6 flours that are considered to be kosher or permissible generally are wheat, of course, rye, oat, spelt, barley, and kamut, which is another. Spelt and kamut are wheat derivatives. They're considered they're part of the ancient grain family that you sometimes see. So I'm quite happy with this. I'm going to put this aside and talk about flour a little bit more while you are all catching up. So I have in the recipe, the flour that I generally use is an all-purpose flour, and that may surprise a few people. If you go and look up at, so you can use this or any other all-purpose flour. I happen to use this because, you know, those guys are in Oregon, and I like supporting local companies. A lot of recipes use bread flour, like this kind of stuff here. Also from the same company. It's great flour. We use it a lot. But you can see here what it says. It's, you know, intended to be for ciabatta and pretzels and bagels and rolls and buns. Bread flour gives you a more chewy consistency, right? Think bagels. And we're trying to make challah. We don't want to make a giant braided bagel. So I personally try and stay away from the bread flour for challah. A lot of people say, well, what about whole wheat? Yes, you can absolutely use whole wheat flour. You can substitute volume by volume. So instead of using 4 cups of the all-purpose flour, you could use 3 cups all-purpose and 1 cup of whole wheat, or 50-50 or something like that. If you go and have almost always whole or almost exclusively whole wheat, I personally, I'm not a huge fan of that flavor. I like mixing it a little bit. What works extremely well, I'm going to show you 2 more. These guys here, this is a company that's available on Amazon. This is white spelt flour. So this is bread flour or all-purpose flour, but it's made from spelt. And this is the companion. It's the whole wheat spelt flour that goes with it. And the beauty with spelt flour is it is actually much, much friendlier and gentler to the tummies. In our family, we have 2 people who have trouble with wheat. And it's not the gluten. In wheat, there's another protein that causes some sort of stress on the tummy. And we've converted a lot of our bread recipes to spelt. We use spelt pasta. We use a lot of spelt products. And that has helped us to overcome these. The beauty here is you don't have to go all the way to gluten-free land where it's really hard. You can all of a sudden, nothing rises anymore. And without gluten, you know, you can't build those strands and so on and so forth. So spelt is, if you have any tummy issues and you suspect it might be the wheaten or the baked products, start experimenting with spelt. It might help you a great deal. Okay, how are we doing? Is everybody sort of caught up and in a happy place? Okay, I hear you wave, I see you waving, but I can't hear you. All right? Okay. So I'm going to wash my hands real quick.
We're a little bit behind. Ours was very sticky. We had to add a lot more flour.
Mine's sticky also.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that.
Sorry. Yeah, when it's too wet, try adding a tablespoon or 2 tablespoons at a time. And when it's too
Oh, we've added a lot more than that.
If it's still sticky, does that mean it's not done being kneaded?
well, it's supposed to be a little sticky, right? You want that stickiness that at the end of the day, that's the gluten. So again, you know, I can show you one. Here's one that I made earlier that we're going to use for the kneading. And here, it's not sticking in the bowl. It came out clean out of the bowl, but it's still really malleable and sticky.
But it's not sticking to your hands.
It's not sticking to my hands, no.
And do ours need to rise overnight?
You can, so usually the bread, so there's 2 rises. There is, after you knead it, there is about an hour rise. And then you would knead it, and then you give it a second rise for another hour, and then you would bake it off. If you let it rise much longer or let it sit out much longer, it will overproof and it will turn sour. So if you do want to have bread that you make the evening before, you know, a lot of people are really busy on Fridays. How do you get fresh oven warm challah on the table? You make it the night before, great idea. So what you would do is you braid the challah and then you put it in the refrigerator overnight. And the refrigerator stops the fermentation process and stops it from rising further. It slows everything down. And then just before you want to bake it off, you take it out of the fridge, let it warm up and rise for an hour, hour and a half, and then bake it off on Friday. That's what I'm going to do tomorrow.
In the same way, you can also do it right after this stage. Once it's done kneading, you can refrigerate it covered in cellophane and then
Absolutely.
take it out and
yeah, absolutely. That's what I did with this one here. I made this earlier this afternoon because I wanted to move right from here's my kneading to shaping. The other half of this batch here I used for the loaf that I showed you earlier, right? So it's exactly what I did with this, and I kept this in the fridge for a couple hours this afternoon. Again, it's helpful to add a little bit of yeast because the yeast doesn't really like the cold, and I sometimes feel that some of the yeast may die off, or you know, I find that the bread often doesn't rise as well when it comes out of the refrigerator, and that you can counter that by adding a little yeast, maybe an extra teaspoon or so. People often, I mean, you can also freeze the challah, then you would need to add even a little more yeast. I have to say I've never been able to do that with challah that really is still rising as nicely and still as fluffy as we like to have it here. All right, so if that's okay with folks, I'd like to move on to the shaping. And there's a useful tool here. You can, so for the perfectionists, you can weigh your parts, or you can just eyeball it. I think I'm going to eyeball it right now and just cut this into 3 pieces. There are many, 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 many different videos on the internet and how to braid challah in 3 strands, 4 strands. There's one that I think goes all the way to 9. So they show 3 strand, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's really fun to watch. And there's also different techniques to make round challahs for the holidays. And that's actually a second part of this class here that we're going to do in early September, I believe, on a Sunday. And I'm going to show you how to make round challahs and how to put a little bit of apples and honey in there, or other things if you like. So in order to get from these 3 to the strands, there's different techniques. One is you can just roll and roll and roll and roll. What I like to do is I actually like to use a rolling pin. You can see here, I don't know if you noticed, I haven't floured my surface. I'm not going to flour my rolling pin. This is not sticky once it's started here. So by using the rolling pin, this is still a little cold. I took it out too late. By using the rolling pin, I'm able to shape it in sort of this elongated kind of form. And then note that this is also what you would do if you wanted to fill something. So if you wanted to put, one of the things that our boys love is challah with chocolate in it. They dance and die over that. So all you do there is you use a little spreader and use some nougat cream and spread that over the top. And then you just go like this, and you would roll that nougat cream into your strand. Close off the ends. And then you would have a filled strand. It's the same technique that we're going to be using to fill those with apples and honey. Except there we're going to use 4 strands.
And for those of us who just did the kneading, now we cover it with plastic wrap and leave it for an hour. Is that what?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay.
And then you would basically do what I'm doing now, which is the shaping part. Again, I'm going to roll this up. Another thing that you can put in there that works really, really nicely is raisins, or anything else that you desire here. This dough, I have to apologize. I should have taken this out sooner. It's a little cold. Doesn't want to be shaped yet.
So do you do this after 1 hour? You said there were 2 cycles of 1 hour.
2 cycles of 1 hour, yes. So you let it rise for about an hour, or for it to double in size. That's sort of the rule of thumb there. And then you do the braiding, and then you let it rise again.
Okay, so you braid it and then let it rise again. Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Because every time you touch it, you squeeze the air out of it, right? So the last rise is the one that gives you all the air, all the fluffiness. And after that, you just want to bake it off, right? You don't want to touch it anymore.
So you don't need to knead it again?
You don't need to knead it again. All I did now is this one here is, like I said, it's a little cold, so I'm trying to warm it up a little bit. All you do is you sort of press the air, to push the air out of it for the second rise, and then you shape it. There's a couple useful tools that I want to show you. You saw the little dough cutter here. I talked about the silicone mat that I personally love using. There is, if you do have so these are great to use. You'll recognize those from your pizza parlor. Those are pizza shakers that you might find at Pagliacci's or other places with cheese and pepper flakes. I use them for flour. So to flour my surface is really, really easy, really, really nice, not messy. Or if you like, some people like putting toppings on their challah, like poppy seed or sesame seeds or things like that. It's also great to apply those evenly here. So these are $1.50 each. Great investment for your kitchen arsenal. All right, so I'm going to try and get those even length here. Still a little bit cold, but I think we're getting there.
So the quantity you gave us was for 2 challahs, not 1. Is that correct?
Yes. The recipe is designed for 2 challahs. So the first thing you do is you would split your batch into 2 for the 2 loaves, and then you split each loaf into, or each part into, as many strands that you'd like to use. The most basic technique is using the 3-strand Challah, which is also, it's really, really easy, really fast. I move the camera over here a little bit. I sometimes use 4 strands, but I always, whenever I do, I forget what I did, and then I have to look it up again, and then I don't do it. But it's nice. I mean, you could do as many strands as you have members in the family, for example. That would be a really, really nice touch, I think. If there's 5 of you, look up a 5-strand Challah and make that, and then you serve it, and you have a strand for every person in your family as part of the Challah. I think that would be a really nice tradition. So to braid it, you sort of stick the ends together like this, and then for the 3-strand braid, and I think anybody who's ever had long hair, I don't have to tell you how this works, is you take the middle and you start to one side, let's say left, and then I take my new middle and go right, and then I take my new middle and I go left, and my new middle and I go right again, my new middle left, my new middle right, my new middle left, my new middle goes right. And these are not even. I should have weighed them. My new middle this way. And this one is almost a little short. I can scrunch this under here and scrunch this under here, and that's it. That's a really basic need for baking. I prefer cookie sheets, flat, rather over pans, but that's a question of taste. And I usually put parchment paper on them because I'm too lazy to clean the cooking sheets. I'm going to do something that I usually don't do, but in the interest of time today, I'm going to apply the egg wash right away. Usually I do that just before baking because it dries on, and then it doesn't come out as nice and shiny. Maybe I'll do it twice, but for now I want to use I want to move to the egg wash phase. Are there any questions before we advance?
I have a question. Is there a certain thickness of the strands that you think is best in terms of before you braid it?
Best, and by what criteria?
Well, just that it comes out nicely, that it cooks more evenly, you know, or thinner, thicker, does it matter?
Well, in general, I think flatter is better. So the 3-strand is probably one of the ones that is nice, but I've seen beautiful 6 strands that are also flat. The 4-strand has sort of a rib in the middle. It's kind of tallish, but I can't say that they would bake unevenly or would give any problems in baking. It's when you fill them that the baking gets a little tricky, because depending on the filling, there might be some liquid oozing out, and then the inside is still wet while the outside is already drier. But the shaping I didn't find makes a big difference. Good question though. Any other questions before we move on? All right, so for the egg wash, 1 egg yolk and about a tablespoon of water. You just mix it. And then again, I use a silicone brush. They're easy to clean. They don't get this one here. We've probably had this for 10 years. The hair brushes we tend to throw away after a while. So you just mix it, and then often the boys do it, and then it comes out in really interesting shapes and designs. When I do it, I just braid down, I brush down each individual strand piece that I can see, follow the strand, and that gives a nice even coating. Again, this is not what you would usually do. You would not braid and immediately apply the egg wash. I'm doing this since we don't have time to sit around for an hour watching it rise. You see that I'm applying it fairly liberally, and there's lots of it that goes on the sheet. It's another good reason to use the parchment paper, because you just, at the end, toss it. So if this rises for 45 minutes, an hour, It's ready to be baked off. Very simple, 350 degrees. For this particular amount of flour, about 25, 26 minutes is the right amount of time. You will find out depending on the flour or whatever you use. Try using the same, once you've zeroed in on the flour, try using the same flour. That way you have a repeatable ratio between flour and water, and you know your baking time and all that, and you don't have to do that. So assuming this was baked, actually, why don't we get the one that is? Then I see Victoria on the line here. She's going to immediately recognize what those dark spots are, right? Are you licking your lips? So how do you know it's done in the oven? There's two things that you can do. What most people do is just use a wooden toothpick, stick it in, and it's supposed to come out clean, so nothing's sticking to it. If something is sticking to it, means it's still too wet inside, and you need to bake it a little bit. If you want to go the scientific way, which sometimes helps, especially if you're trying new recipes. For example, if you're making a bread that you've never used before, or made before, or you're using a recipe you've never done before, a food thermometer helps. We use those all the time. For bread, it's actually 190 degrees core temperature. So if you're unsure whether your bread is done or not, and you don't trust the toothpick, and you don't want to knock on it or do any of these other things, this guy here, you stick it roughly into the middle, and then the tip reads 190. If the tip reads 190 degrees, your bread is ready and can come out of the oven. So these are some.
What temperature do you bake it at?
190. So the oven temperature is 350 degrees. The bread
For how
is
long?
ready. The bread for this particular recipe is for the 4 cup for about 25, 26 minutes. And then you can measure, and at 190 degrees is when it's done. All right. So I can't show you how yummy this bread is, but I have volunteers in the house who will demonstrate for you. So let me call them. Benson, Simon, all the time.
It's not sliding.
Well, you don't.
I don't think mine is going to look like his.
Chef's already ate his treat.
Okay, Samson. All right, this is Simon. His brother will be here shortly. Okay. Do you want to say the Hamotzi with me? Hamotzi lehem min haaretz. Amen. Here you go, boo-boo. All right. So you see, one of the hallmarks of this recipe is it's really, where's the camera here? It's really light and airy and fluffy bread. And that's part due to the recipe, but also due to the use of the all-purpose flour. So with bread flour, it wouldn't be as fluffy. It would definitely be chewier than it is in this case here.